My presentation is going to be divided into two parts today. We're going to be talking first about fescue toxicosis as it relates to resistance, so cattle that are more resistant, some work we're doing related to that in Woodford County at the University of Kentucky farm. In the second half, we'll focus on the red clover work and some of our work looking at forage phytochemicals and how we can harness those to get some benefits for our Kentucky cattle. Looks like we're good to go. So everybody here has heard of the fescue belt because we all have fescue, right? And so this area of the country is extremely important for the beef industry because it has a bunch of grass that we can graze cattle on. It's not so suitable for row crops, but man, tall fescue loves this area of the country and provides us a really great forage. So there's about 13.2 million cows in this area of the country, with accounting for about 40% of the U.S. beef cow herd in total. And like I said, fescue is a great forage. It provides us a lot of benefits for growing cows and calves and stockers in this region. But when it's consumed in excess, it can cause fescue toxicosis, which is a syndrome that costs the beef industry $2 billion annually. So it's a really significant economic problem, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So I'm going to give you a brief background on fescue toxicosis. I know everybody's probably already heard about this, and I know you heard about it last year, so I'll keep it short. So when fescue is infected with an endophytic fungus, this fungus can produce compounds that confer benefits to the plant, but when consumed by the animal can cause several detriments. One being vasoconstriction, and this can be vasoconstriction to the periphery of the animal, reductions in blood flow, but also to things like the reproductive tract and gastrointestinal organs. And then another key sign of fescue toxicosis is a very large reduction in serum prolactin, or circulating hormones. So fescue toxicosis is a syndrome, and there are several different outcomes that can occur when an animal consumes too much fescue. Some animals have multiple of these things occur in them. Some you can see, some you can't see. But generally, probably the number one problem associated with fescue toxicosis is increased heat stress. And part of that is due to that vasoconstriction, because when animals are hot, they're pumping blood to the skin, trying to cool off their bodies. And they can't do that when they're vasoconstricted. That blood won't flow fast enough to cool them off, and they get more hot, even in thermoneutral temperatures. We often see changes in nutrient utilization and forage intake, which can confer reductions in weight gain in combination with that heat stress, as well as retained hair coat. That's probably what you see most in your field, are bleached out long hair coats, animals standing in puddles. That's pretty typical of fescue toxicosis as well. We see impaired reproduction, which we'll talk a little bit about, impaired milk production, which relates to that prolactin depression, and that can lead to lower birth weights, lower weaning weights. That's obviously not what we want to see. And in extreme cases, we'll see vasoconstriction that can result in sloughing of the extremities. So things like fescue foot, you'll see over on that slide. It's ugly, but it can happen. And also, more recently, people have been demonstrating fat necrosis in these cattle. So there's been half a century of research done on fescue toxicosis, and my colleagues and others and people before me have learned so much about this syndrome and different aspects of this syndrome. But the one thing that we just really don't know, and is probably the most important thing, is why do we have cattle that look like number 8 up there versus that heifer right next to her? Why do they look like that? When they come from the same group or the same origin or the same, they're born on your farm, right? Same genetics. Base genetics, and you can get this variation. And so there's been some research to try to pinpoint why this occurs, but there's several factors that go into it, and we've never really been able to get that answered. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, is this resistance versus susceptibility concept. So we had a really nice discussion last night at dinner, but there are so many different things that can influence fescue toxicosis resistance in cattle. And the first I always think of is health or nutrition history. If you're putting an animal that's underconditioned onto fescue pasture, or they might have a residual lung problem due to a previous infection, they might have an exacerbated response to that fescue. Things like detoxification capacity, that's something my research team has spent a lot of time on. Ruminants are amazing. They have microbes right in the front of their gut that can degrade toxins. We can feed them round bales that have some mold in it. We can expose them to toxins, and they don't die because they're detoxified. And we've been able to show that things like ergovaline in fescue can also be detoxified by ruminants, and so there's probably a role of that detoxification in resistance. Voluntary intake, what a simple concept. Does animal A eat less fescue than animal B? Maybe there's some differences in who's consuming that fescue or how they select that fescue. A very obvious one is prior exposure. Has the animal been exposed to fescue early in its life? And it's a big part of the project that I'm about to show you. Exposure to things, we know animals can adapt, and we've been able to show that there is some adaptation in some animals that can occur when they're naive to fescue and are then exposed. Although there are also animals that do not adapt, and so there is that as well. And then, of course, genetics. And I say that last because it's probably the first one we think of. And genetics can obviously influence all of these other factors as well. So in order to think about that, like I said, there's been some research on individual areas of what I just listed, but nothing that's really put the whole picture together. And so we've got this project that I like to call the Montana-Kentucky Heifer Swap Project, and we just completed year 1 in 2024, and we're going to be starting year 2 in 2025. But I am going to share with you some of our preliminary data today, partly to illustrate the extremes that occur in fescue toxicosis, but also to give you an idea of what you might be hearing about from our research team over the next couple years. This research is a collaboration between my research team at USDA-ARS FAPRU and University of Kentucky. Shout out to Dr. Les Anderson. He's my partner in this research. He probably can answer a lot of questions that I might not be able to answer. And then also our colleagues at USDA-ARS Livestock and Range Research Laboratory in Miles City, Montana. Dr. Tom Geary and Dr. Richard Waterman are also operating on this project. And so we know transportation of cattle is an unavoidable but potentially detrimental aspect of the cattle industry, right? Not only do animals have to deal with the stress of being transported, they then have to adapt to their new environment. And if you think about just Montana versus Kentucky, you know, there's obvious geographic and environmental differences there that will occur, but also they're adapting to a brand new grazing system. So the animals in Kentucky are raised on pastures predominantly, while out west you see a lot more range grazing, and that's different. Grazing can be a learned behavior, and so there's some aspects to that we don't understand. Another thing that everyone seems to note is that when you bring cattle from out west and put them on our Kentucky endophyte infected tall fescue pastures, they tend to fall apart, and they take forever to adapt. And that's if they don't die or you don't cull them from your herd in the meantime. And so there's a lot of economic and performance losses that producers have to incur if they decide to take on that challenge. So really the goal of this project is to identify critical factors that influence an animal's ability to adapt to different grazing systems, but also that dictate their resistance or susceptibility to fescue toxicosis. And then hopefully be able to use all of that information that we gain from this study to identify some really targeted solutions that producers can use. So this study, we have heifers that we source from Montana that we consider to be endophyte infected tall fescue naive, both in genetics and in practice. They weren't out there grazing endophyte infected tall fescue before they came. And then native Kentucky heifers that we sourced from central Kentucky. And so we considered that to be our adapted heifer group. So what we did is we transported animals from Montana to Kentucky and Kentucky to Montana to go on different grazing treatments. And we also left some Montana animals in Montana and some Kentucky animals in Kentucky, so we had that control and we were able to see how it compared to their native grazing environment. And so in Kentucky, which is what we'll be primarily focusing on today, we had Kentucky animals grazing endophyte infected tall fescue, so those adapted animals. And then we took the Montana animals and we either grazed them on endophyte infected tall fescue or what we expected to see most of the problems, or we put them on endophyte-free tall fescue to see how that relates to just grazing adaptation without any toxic effects. And so we received these animals in March. We make the swap in May. the animals in Kentucky go out to pasture, and then in June, the Montana animals go out to range. And so obvious environmental differences, but that's what works in their systems. Our breeding season was 3 rounds of AI from the beginning of June, the end of June, beginning of July, and then the end of July, beginning of August. And you can see that's a little bit late, but we were trying to look at heat stress in this study as well. So we wanted to get that breeding window somewhere where we could really study that. Animals were sampled monthly, essentially, over this period until October when they were dispersed. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview of all the things that we measured on this animal, and I'm telling you we took every sample you could ever take off these heifers. But I'm not going to present all that to you today. We don't have time for all of that. So the first thing we did, which was kind of unique, is we wanted to look at grazing behavior and activity in these animals. So we outfitted them with cow manager, accelerometer, ear tags, and that can tell you things like how much activity they had as it relates to estrus or just general activity around the pasture, eating, and rumination. And then they were outfitted with these cool halters, some halters. And so the halter's different. It's got an accelerometer like the ear tag, so it can tell you how much they're moving, but it has like a fluid band over their nose that's a pressure sensor, and it'll tell you every bite they take, if it's an eating bite or a rumination bite, how they're eating, how much they're eating, how much they're ruminating. And so we can really get a strong picture of grazing behavior. A lot of other measures, so we took some samples for genetic analysis, we monitored the environment, humidity, temperature, et cetera, and also monitored the pasture. We got to know if there's endophyte infected tall fescue in there. We took measures of growth performance, average daily gain, body condition score, and then also some measures of rumen function and microbiome to try to look at that capacity for detoxification. We took measures of heat stress, core body temperature. Each animal had a rumen bolus that would tell us every minute of the day who was heat stressed. Les and I, our phones beeped endlessly, which I will show you in a minute, from when we started grazing until August. We took respiration rates 3 times a week out in the field, hair coat scores, blood flow measures, so we can look at that vasoconstriction aspect, different stress markers, and also hair cortisol, which is a measure of a long-term stress measure. We looked at hoof conformation, reproductive performance, obviously, and then also some temperament measures were worked in towards the end. So today I'm really going to cover the broad brushstrokes of each of these categories, and we're going to start out with average daily gain. And in heifers, at this state, we're not really worried about average daily gain, but body weight maintenance and maintenance of body condition score is pretty important when we get to breeding. And so right here, you'll see this is the first month of grazing from May to June, the first 30 days. Our gray bars are Kentucky E+ animals. You can see that they had a steady gain of weight. They got on pasture and they kept gaining weight pretty well, but our Montana E+ animals lost weight drastically. You're looking at a range, of more than a pound loss per day, which is excessive, right? Not what we want to see in our animals right before we want to breed them. And then you can see in our Montana E-, they did better than the E+. Obviously, there's an endophyte effect there, but they didn't gain any weight, so they weren't doing all too good either. Now, if you look at this over the first 100 days, so let's go all the way to August now to see how they were able to adapt over that time. You can see Kentucky chugged along just as expected, but Montana E+, they were able to have some compensatory gain, but they still didn't look anything like Kentucky, and so they weren't able to compensate within 100 days. Montana E-, they did all right. They were able to compensate quite a bit better than the Montana E+ cattle. Now, this translated right to body condition score, and so this is average body condition score from May to August, and you can see that the Montana E+ cattle had about a half a unit lower body condition score than the Kentucky E+, and so pretty significant differences occurred early in grazing. So now if we lay this over with our animals that were in Montana, so our Kentucky group and our Montana group in Montana, in the dashed lines there, you can see there's really no difference. Those animals in Montana had similar body weight despite different sources. They could just chug along. They went over there and did fine as it concerned to body weight. But heifers in Kentucky gained way less than heifers in Montana, and it didn't matter what group it was. They gained less. And you can still see those differences with Montana E Plus obviously having the lowest change in gain. And so there really appears to be both an endophyte and a source effect on weight gain, especially here in Kentucky. So moving on to look a little bit on heat stress. I'm sure everyone here has heard of THI, or the temperature humidity index. I'm going to refer to that some in this presentation. It essentially takes into account outside air temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation to give you an index of the susceptibility of your cattle to heat stress in a varying range of levels from normal to emergency levels. So when we looked at respiration rate in these animals from May to August, so from more thermoneutral to more heat stress conditions, every single month the E Plus from Montana had terrible respiration rates compared to the other animals. And so that persisted all the way through August. And so if you kind of overlay that and think about what those respiration rates really mean or might look like in the field, in May and June, the respiration rates would have, for these Montana E Plus heifers, would be considered a danger level. So this would be the maximum remediation is needed for heat stress in very thermoneutral conditions in May. And so it was really impressive how heat stressed they were even under thermoneutral conditions, which goes with fescue toxicosis, but you can see that the Kentucky E Plus adapted heifers didn't have nearly the same problems. In July and August, they maintained that high respiration rate at an alert level. And so there really appears to be both an endophyte and source effect on respiration rate as well. So here we're looking at hair coat score. Usually we blame heat stress on hair coat, right? They retain that hair coat, it insulates them, and they get hotter. And so we see that from May to June, all heifers were able to shed most of their winter hair coat, and groups were pretty similar by June. But if you look at July and August, these naive heifers from Montana that are on the E Plus treatment actually had an increase in hair coat score. And so one of the challenges with fescue toxicosis is they not only don't shed their coat, they also regrow extra long coats in the middle of the summer, and Montana heifers did that. And so that was really interesting to see in such a short amount of time. And so we could probably attribute some of the differences in heat stress to their hair coat score, but probably not entirely. So more to learn there. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is the reproductive data, and I did not run statistics on this because we only have 1 year of data, but I wanted to share with you some of the trends that Les and I found to be particularly interesting. So you can see this is the Kentucky breeding data from round 1, 2, and 3 separated, and then their final pregnancy rate. And you can see that in round 1 and round 3, you see a little bit of an effect of treatment, or it appears to be a little bit, but round 2 is the big time here. So round 2 is in late June, and we had a bunch of emergency heat days right in that period when we were breeding. And so again, it all ties together. We've got loss of body condition, we have heat stress, and it's translating right to their breeding percentages. So it is clearly all works together, and these Montana animals were really suffering. So lay that next to our Montana results, what occurred in Montana, those first 2 bars, the Montana group and the Kentucky group, you can see kind of an effective transport by looking at these data. So if you look at the conception rate, first round AI, and you look at that Kentucky bar in Montana and then compare it to the Kentucky E Plus bar in Kentucky, you can see that animals that were shipped to Montana had lower conception rate conception rates than the animals that were remained in Kentucky, and vice versa, with the endophyte infected tall fescue making that worse. And you can still see an artifact of that when you look at the final pregnancy rate. And so we're hoping that with more data, we'll be able to see this a little bit in a more concrete form, but it certainly is exciting to see these results. So I wanted to include some other notable observations just because there was so much that we were able to see. And so the first one was some of the halter data. So in the first 30 days of grazing, the naive heifers from Montana spent more times grazing and less time ruminating compared to adapted heifers. And this is really interesting because they lost all that weight, but they were trying to eat a bunch and they weren't ruminating. And we know that rumination is a sign of health and well-being, and so clearly that translates to the animals not feeling all too good during that period. We haven't gone past that, but we're looking forward to learning more about that. It took several months for the naive heifers to use the shade structures. We had shade structures in every pasture. They didn't even try to use them. They stood out in the middle of the day. We drive out those Montana heifers, no matter what the treatment, out grazing. Why were they grazing? Nobody knows, but they were, and that probably contributed to heat stress, learning that behavior. And like I said, Les and I got continuous notifications about heat stress. 109 temperatures, 110 temperatures in heifers throughout that period. We also noted in both places that the heifers transported to new locations had worsening temperament when they were transported, and the endophyte infected tall fescue made it worse. And I and the folks in Montana were like, man, why did they send us their awful heifers? Like, they're so terrible. But I had the benefit that I had seen them before they shipped and after they got there, and then tracked them all the way through. And so I knew they didn't ship me the bad heifers. They were perfectly fine in Montana. They were perfectly fine in Kentucky. But something about that adaptation to environment and also the endophyte really exacerbates those symptoms. And so we were able to do some exit velocities with Dr. Eric Van Zandt at University of Kentucky towards the end of the study, and he was still able to pull out a difference between our treatment groups with that endophyte infected tall fescue Montana treatment having the worst exit velocities or the fastest, most excitable exit velocities. And he said it was the biggest difference he's ever seen. So we're looking forward to expanding on that next year and getting that data in Montana as well. So I have no answers for you. I'm sorry about that. No answers. I have some answers in the second half of the presentation, I hope, but stay tuned. I just wanted you to know what you're going to be hearing about from me and last probably for the next 2 years plus. Who knows how long we'll be talking about this. So moving on to solutions, okay? We've talked about the problem. It's a really ugly problem, but there's a ton of solutions for this. People have been working on solutions forever, and all of them work in a different capacity. And so you have people that have worked on things like soy hull supplementation on pasture, strategic spraying of chaparral to suppress seed head emergence, or even these novel endophytes, right? I mean, we've heard about all of these things. They all work. So typically we think, just getting rid of it is the best option, right? Let's just get rid of it, replace it with novel endophyte. But unfortunately, this is Eden Shale. These are the paddocks. You can't see it super well. We do some research up there with KBN, and you can see that sometimes topography and geography and all these things can really destroy the capacity for renovating pastures. Nobody wants to drive up and down those pastures and kill everything and then spend a year and a half trying to put something new back in. So some of that Kentucky E+ tall fescue, and in addition to be just a great forage when we can manage it, is also because it just can grow on steep hillsides with rock, and we all have those in Kentucky, and so sometimes that replacing it is not always the magic bullet that everybody can use. And so the first thing I want to introduce is functional foods, because everybody's heard of this, right? You probably all have been told at some point to eat a few servings of fatty fish a week to be able to improve your cardiovascular health, or some blueberries or dark chocolate or something like that, right? And so functional foods are foods that provide health benefits beyond basic nutrition because they contain bioactive food components or compounds. And so we call these nutraceuticals, superfoods, foods as medicine, things of that nature. We can apply that right to animal nutrition, and we already are. And so all that it takes is that we're looking for feeds that contain bioactive compounds that confer animal production or health benefits beyond basic nutrition. So usually these feeds are consumed regularly as part of the ration at a relatively small proportion, so not a lot in the diet, but it's distinct from a feedstuff that just provides basic nutrition. And so these are functional feeds, or something that we're already using. You might be already using or employing, whether you know it or not, in your management system, but something that we're really focused on for fescue toxicosis. And so I like to think about it, animals on these native pastures have been having this chemoscape to pick from, right? They self-medicate. They not only select forages based on nutrition, they select them based on these bioactive compounds that might combat fescue toxicosis, make them less heat stress. And so that's been going on forever, right? They're adapted to that. Now, our pastures are much less diverse. They're managed and they don't have the same diversity as those native pastures, but there's plenty of phytochemicals out there, believe me. They're all over the place, and those animals are selecting for that. There's tons of research, and I'm not going to go into a bunch of background because we just don't have time. But that have looked at these functional feeds in livestock production. And so today we're going to be focusing on red clover, but I want you to know that this isn't a new thing. I'm not coming up with something brilliant that nobody's ever thought of. People have been working on it forever. But we found red clover. So legumes, most notably red clover, contain bioactive isoflavones that are part of the flavonoid family. They're antioxidants and phytoestrogens. But they also have two other benefits within the animal. So they can cause increased growth performance by altering the rumen microbial community and making them more efficient at utilizing their nutrition. We're not going to talk about that today. We're going to focus on this vasorelaxant property as it relates to fescue toxicosis. So these are some Doppler ultrasound images of two steers. One of them that has fescue toxicosis that you can see is vasoconstricted. The artery area looks smaller. And then on the right, we have our vasodilated animal that has a much larger artery diameter. So looking at vasoconstriction, I compiled some graphs kind of summarizing many studies that we have done. And so we have shown repeatedly that red clover improves blood flow with fescue toxicosis. And so if you look at that graph, we have our endophyte infected tall fescue treatment, so just grazing endophyte infected tall fescue. We have OS, which is overseeded red clover, 15% hay supplemented daily, 15% hay supplemented every other day, and then also a 20% mineral, so a mineral that contains about 20 grams or 1 ounce approximately of red clover that an animal consumes a day. And all of them reverse vasoconstriction. When we look at weight gain, this is something we're a bit more interested in. Same setup here. We can see that red clover, regardless of your management option, increases average daily gain in steers grazing endophyte infected tall fescue pastures. So if you compare the treatments to the endophyte infected tall fescue grazing only control, you get about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds per day per animal, or about 90 to 135 pounds over 90 days of grazing. So pretty significant benefits by adding in some red clover. If you compare it to just a protein match supplemented control, so if you were just feeding dried distillers grains, which will also improve your performance on fescue pastures, you get about 1/3 to 6/10 of a pound improvement in gain over that with red clover. So if you use red clover instead of dried distillers grains or in combination. And that results in about 27 to 54 pounds over 90 days of grazing per animal, so pretty significant benefit. Another aspect that we've been really interested in is post-graze recovery. So we know that endophyte infected tall fescue grazing recovery can take more than 30 days after you take them off the pasture. And so sometimes these animals are discounted at sale because they're shaggy and underconditioned. But we also know that they have a greater susceptibility to stress, and they're getting on a truck probably and going somewhere. So we have to worry about that in terms of their health, which gives them an increased risk of morbidity and mortality. And so if you look at this graph here, we've got our 15% everyday hay and then 50% every other day compared to our DDG control. And you can see that red clover clearly shortens recovery from fescue toxicosis, if not eliminates that recovery period, which could have some really significant impacts. So the next thing I wanted to cover is, what about market cows? We're in the state of Kentucky. We care about cows, right? So we know that culling is a normal part of annual herd management. We see a 15 to 20% turnover in cow inventory every year, with that can account as much as 10 to 30% of a cow-calf operations revenue. And so we know grazing these market cows can add value, but can red clover be incorporated to change that? And so this is some work we did in collaboration with Kentucky Beef Network. And what we found is yes, in 65 days of grazing, and if we look at change in body condition score, red clover can improve body condition by as much as 1 unit in 65 days of grazing on cull cows. And these are market cows bought at the stockyards, you know. Dan bought a group of cows, Dan and Greg. They brought them to Eden Shale. We put them on some red clover, and they gained a body condition unit. So it was pretty impressive. And then if you look at added value per head, you're looking at about $150 what we got that year on endophyte infected tall fescue alone by grazing for 65 days. Very effective. You get more money by keeping them a little bit longer. But you get bumped to about $200 to $225. Some animals were $300 with that red clover. So you can have some significant added value by adding in this red clover into the diet. Moving on to look at heat stress. So another thing we've seen, which goes right with that vasoconstriction aspect, is that red clover eliminates heat stress when animals are challenged with endophyte infected tall fescue. And I use the word eliminate pretty carefully, but it is essentially eliminated. So when we had steers that were challenged with endophyte infected tall fescue and heat stress, and we're looking at emergency level heat stress, and we gave them 25 grams per day, so this much red clover per day, we saw lower respiration rates, and you can see there the respiration rates on the graph, the red line being red clover, an enormous difference, and also the same with rectal temperatures. And that translated to greater feed intake in those animals and also rumination time. And so it's quite effective at eliminating fescue toxicosis related heat stress. And then when we take this to the field, I promise you this is the last study I'm going to cover today. We had this study with Berkman Nutrition and with KBN at Eden Shale where we take beef heifers from Eden Shale and we either gave them conventional mineral or we gave them mineral amended with that red clover leaf. And we looked at their performance over the grazing season. And what we saw is we had those ear tag accelerometers again, and we saw that the animals with the red clover mineral had increased activity. They were walking around a lot more than those control animals on endophyte infected tall fescue. Respiration rate, again, we see a reduction in respiration rate in these animals. They were less heat stressed just by having a slightly different mineral source. And then, most impressively, when we look at reproductive performance in these heifers, in May, we really didn't see a difference between reproductive performance, but it was thermoneutral, right? It wasn't hot. Again, in June, we see an enormous difference. We had groups that had no heifers breed in June because it was hot. They were suffering from fescue, toxicosis, but the red clover group, no problem, chugged right along, just like in May. Regardless of that heat stress. And that resulted in a difference in final pregnancy rate. So with that, I just wanted to thank you guys for your attention and remind you, look out in your pasture and think of it more than just tall fescue or just grass. What else can you do in there to make it more diverse and give your animals a chance to select for that biodiversity and self-medicate? And so there's my email and my phone, and I'm here to answer any questions. So thank you so much.
We do have time for 2 or 3 questions. We have roving microphones out here, so there's got to be some. Dr. Anderson's over here. Go ahead.
Good morning. Chris Young, today from Auburn University, tomorrow from Agriplexus, but fascinating work. Did the tags do GPS? Were they GPS or did you just have accelerometer?
So the tags do have GPS capacity. We did not have GPS capacity on the study, and Les and I have been discussing maybe adding that in for this year to be able to track where they are in pasture and get some more information about that behavior. But yes, they do have that capacity, but did not in the study.
Over here. Dr. Webb, is there any commercial availability on the red clover meal and the minerals? Is anybody doing that commercially at this point?
Sir, I wish we were, but Berkman Nutrition is working very, very hard to try to develop a product that we can get out to consumers and producers to apply, because we could talk all about the magic fairy dust of red clover all day, but if we've got nothing to give you to help, that's a problem. So we're working on that really diligently. But remember, there's still the option of interseeding or overseeding clovers into your pastures, or consider those options because they do work just as well.
Thank you.
Chris McBurney, elevation difference between Versailles, Kentucky and Montana?
Yes, but not as much as you would think. It's actually a pretty small difference in elevation, and I would speak to it, but I can't remember what it is. But I was surprised to see that it wasn't a huge difference between Miles City and Kentucky. So we talked about things like elevation influencing their health and behavior, but it's a much smaller change than what you might get in other areas of the out west.
Daniel Hayden, on your grazing, did you all measure different concentrations of red clover in that pasture to see a difference in the effects of it?
Thank you very much for asking that. No, we did not. So for all of you that have put red clover to pasture, you know that year one looks different than year two, and then it's usually there in year three, and then it's gone, right? And so one of the challenges that we've had with doing this research is trying to look at levels, because we interseeded red clover and we wanted to get 30%, and we ended up with 52% red clover in those pastures. And so it's really hard to fine tune that. And that's why we use the hay. And so you can see we did that 15% hay. We did jump very quickly from it overseeded to 15% and down to the mineral. And so we really haven't evaluated anything in between, but I do think, given the brevity of what we have studied and that it all works, that if you had 20% red clover in your pasture, you're probably right on where you need to be to still get those benefits.
Andy Bishop, you had talked about the naive cattle not going to the shade shelters during the day, and I've noticed that in cattle that I brought east as well, and I just wonder if it's a nutrient requirement for those cattle that are brought up on grass where every bite is twice as nutrient dense as the grass they're eating here. The cattle that I always bring east just never stop grazing. It seems like they can't get enough to eat. It's kind of like us eating a steak versus a salad and trying to fill up on salad when they come here. I just wonder if is there any way to maybe measure that?
I'm so glad you shared that observation, actually, because I thought we were kind of crazy that we saw that. So I'm glad to hear that it's happening on real cattle that are being transferred and on producer farms. There's no real easy way to measure that, other than we are monitoring the rumen microbial community and gain and things of that nature. We should be able to learn more about what kind of fermentation that's happening from that feed that they're consuming and how that translates to energy that they're getting. And we might be able to get at some of that by looking at our data, but I'm very glad to hear of that observation. Not that it's a good observation, but, consistency.
Kind of changing gears here. What about Ladina clover compared to red clover? It's so much easier to keep Ladina clover in your pasture versus red clover.
Thank you for asking that. Actually, I didn't include it in this talk, but we did a study because everybody was asking us, can we use other legumes? Because they do all have these isoflavones. They're just different in concentration and proportion, and some do rumen effects and some have vasodilatory effects. But what we found was that we could feed white clover, soybean meal, or red clover at 20% of daily intake in goats, actually, but it would work. I'm sure it will translate to cattle and get the same benefits. So I think if you multiply what you would get in white clover over the pasture in isoflavones, that would be just as much or more than what you're going to get from a handful of red clover leaf. So yes, I do think that that's an effective choice.
We appreciate your questions, but we will have an opportunity for questions at the end. Let's give Dr. Davis another round of applause for a phenomenal presentation. Thank you, Brittany.